Members, this is file item number 4, H.R. 77. Members, we are at file item number 4, H.R. 77 by Mr. Muratsuchi. The clerk will read.
House Resolution 77 by Assemblymember Muratsuchi and others relative to World War II Japanese-American concentration camps.
Mr. Muratsuchi, you are recognized.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise to present House Resolution 77, an apology from our House to all Americans of Japanese ancestry for the past legislative actions of this legislature in support of the unjust exclusion, removal, and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Yesterday marked the 78th anniversary of President Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, which led to the mass incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans without due process of law. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which issued an apology on behalf of the nation for this grave injustice. This historic act of Congress found that the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans was not justified by military necessity, but instead was caused by, quote, race prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. And so you may ask, why is this resolution necessary? This House needs to acknowledge its past mistakes and learn the lessons of history to make sure that we do not allow history to repeat itself. During the years leading up to World War II, California led the nation in fanning the flames of racism and immigrant scapegoating against Japanese Americans. Our House, our legislature in this chamber passed discriminatory laws like the Alien Land Law Act of 1913, which prohibited Japanese immigrants from owning homes or farms. We also passed Senate Concurrent Resolution 15, which after Pearl Harbor called for the firing of all Japanese American state employees because they were feared to be spies. We need to acknowledge this institution's past mistakes in order to learn from them. Furthermore, this resolution is necessary because we see what is happening in our country today. Migrant children from Mexico and Central America being held indefinitely in a former World War II Japanese American camp at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Muslim immigrants being profiled and targeted with sweeping travel bans. Clearly, we still have much to learn from the lessons of history to make sure that we do not allow history to repeat itself. Last but certainly not least, this apology is long overdue. Most Japanese Americans who were in camp have already passed away. But this apology is important to many camp survivors still alive, including those who are here with us today. Members, I respectfully ask for your support for House Resolution 77.
Thank you, Mr. Muratsuchi. Mr. Vopel, you are recognized.
Mr. Speaker, colleagues, I rise in support of H.R. 77. And there's a different take here with another group from the internment camps. Young, second-generation Japanese called Nisei. They formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which became one of the most decorated units of their size in the history of the United States Army. They not only fought the Germans and the Italians, they fought racism, heavy-duty racism. Right after Pearl Harbor, the Hawaiian Japanese formed an organization called the Varsity Victory Volunteers to help dig trenches, bunkers, whatever they could do for the defense of Hawaii. And of course, after they weren't needed anymore, they were disbanded. Didn't bother them. In 1943, Franklin Roosevelt formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It was comprised of 2/3 Hawaiian Japanese and 1/3 mainland Japanese. Now, when they were formed, they didn't get along. It was weird. The mainland Japanese named the Hawaiian Japanese Buddha heads. The Buddha heads named the mainland Japanese katonks, because that's the sound their empty heads made when they hit the barroom floor during fights. So it was very difficult. The unit was considered to be disbanded if they couldn't get it together. Well, a staff member had the good idea of sending the katonks to an internment camp in Arkansas, when the Buddhist heads went with them. Now, the whole unit saw where the katonks came from, and they became a fighting machine. Many battles were fought against the Germans and the Italians. In one of the battles, after the 442nd had spent 10 days in heavy combat with heavy losses, one of the battalions from Texas was surrounded and was in danger of being wiped out. The 442nd saved them. And this was the same battalion that had given them horrible racist grief. But they were almost destroyed saving this battalion. That's the courage of the 442nd. 4,000 were in the unit. Over 18,000 rotated through. Their motto was go for broke. Everything on one dice roll. That was the spirit. Out of 18,000 that served, 9,486 received Purple Hearts. That's 50%. 21 Medals of Honor, the most Medals of Honor in any organization of that size. They had 7 presidential citations. These people who should have had a great, great grudge against their country, served their country, and fought and died in large numbers, and did it out of patriotism and for truth, justice, and liberty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Vopel. Ms. Rubio, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 77 on behalf of the Latino Caucus. Nearly 3/4 of the Japanese population in California in 1940 were removed from their homes and sent to camps in Arkansas and the western states. They were completely uprooted and forced to leave their homes, jobs, and their property seized. This dark era of our nation's history was riddled with racial prejudice and failure of political leadership. The federal government justified interning Japanese Americans in the name of national security. This policy was cruel and short-sighted. Recent national policies spread fear in our immigrant communities, exclude specific religions and ethnicities from entering the U.S., and put children and families in cages at detention centers. It is important that we look to our past and learn from our mistakes. California must lead in this endeavor and show the rest of the nation that we will not stand for racist and paranoid policies that take away basic rights from any person. It is for these reasons that I respectfully ask for your support of H.R. 77.
Thank you, Ms. Rubio. Ms. Friedman, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. This morning, I rise in support of House Resolution 77 on behalf of both the Legislative Jewish Caucus and the Legislative Women's Caucus. H.R. 77 sheds light on a dark chapter in California history. But this resolution goes beyond the injustice of Executive Order 9066, under which 120,000 Americans and residents of Japanese descent were incarcerated in concentration camps. This resolution also acknowledges the role that our predecessors in this very body had in shaping decades' worth of discriminatory and unjust policies that have violated the civil rights and civil liberties of our fellow Californians. They were Californians like Misuyi Endo, who was fired from her job at the DMV in 1942 following the passage of SCR 15, which requested that the State Personnel Board dismiss state employees who may be proved to be disloyal to the country. Ms. Endo courageously filed suit against the state of California, but she was still removed and incarcerated while her suit was pending. It wasn't until 1944 that she was finally released from the concentration camp after the government determined her loyalty to the United States. Resolutions like H.R. 77 cannot undo the destruction caused by our actions 80 years ago. California legislators were certainly complicit in destroying the lives of thousands of their own constituents during World War II. However, with this formal apology, we can take a step towards accountability for the California legislature that trampled over the civil rights of our fellow citizens. With H.R. 77, we can ensure that future generations of Californians learn from the terrible mistakes of our predecessors, and that every day we continue to fight for a more just and a more equal California for all of our residents. I urge an aye vote on H.R. 77. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Friedman. Mr. Gallagher, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I also rise in support of H.R. 77, as I often have in the past when we commemorate and we remember the atrocity that was Japanese internment. Many of my constituents, their grandparents were interned in places like Tule Lake and other internment camps throughout this state. And we have to remember that these were Americans, okay? These were people who immigrated from Japan, but settled here, had established farms here. Many of them were multi-generational. And it doesn't matter that they were multi-generational or not, but they had become citizens, had made this their home. And we said to American citizens, we took their property. We took their property away from them and we put them in camps without any due process of law. What this country did and this state did needs to be apologized for. It needs to be recognized for the atrocity that it was. That's not who we are supposed to be as Americans. And the state did play a key role in that. Ironically, it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And yet when hysteria and fear came in on this issue, he gave in to it. And Earl Warren, who was another key architect of internment, gave in to that fear. And many politicians, as has been pointed out, gave in to that fear and hysteria and allowed that fear to then turn into taking away people's civil rights. And certainly I think that's something we should always think about. We have talked about Chinese exclusion, very similar. You would think that we would have learned our lesson because only 6 years before, Chinese exclusion and hysteria had taken over, and those policies were passed. And then in the 40s, Japanese internment. So we do need to recognize what happens in this body, and it is relevant to today. That when we allow fear to guide us, we often do things that undermine people's rights. And I would say when we have a righteous fear, even when we might have a righteous fear, we have a righteous fear of gun violence in this country. But if we let that fear lead us to undermining citizens' lawful and constitutional rights, when law-abiding citizens' rights are undermined out of a fear of what could happen, we should be thinking about that. Climate change is a very real issue that many in this body want to do something about. But when we have a fear that leads us to take away people's property rights, that leads us to take away people's right to make decisions about how they want to work, the crops that they want to grow, the cars that they want to drive, when we start saying we have to take away your rights because we only have 10 years, and we use hysteria to do things to take away people's rights, we should be thinking about those things. There's many examples that we can point to. It's always relevant for us to remember that we do have nothing to fear but fear itself. But let's actually live up to that motto when we're making policy. Let's not allow fear to lead us to undermining people's rights. That is the lesson, I believe, of history. And hopefully we will continue. Hopefully we will have learned the lessons of history. And I think it starts by supporting this resolution today, apologizing for this atrocity of the past, of what we did to our fellow Americans. May it never happen again. Thank you.
Dr. Weber, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise on behalf of the California Legislative Black Caucus in support of H.R. 77. We must acknowledge the mistakes and of our own government itself. Too often we choose to ignore inconvenient truths until it is too late, until the pain has been borne too long, or until communities have been broken and scattered. We often have the tendency to think that we're Pontius Pilate, that we can wash our hands of these matters and things will be okay. But fully apologizing to our Japanese Americans who suffered through internment recognizes and requires an accurate accounting of actions that California took to ensure the internment and subjugation of Japanese Americans. We sometimes think that Order 9066 really began in 1942, but the reality is, as has been pointed out by our members, that the whole issue of the Alien Land Act in 1913 was forbidding ownership of land by Japanese Americans. And in 1945, this very legislature once again acted to decouple American citizens from their civil liberties by directing the Attorney General to vigorously pursue these land laws while Japanese Americans were interned and unable to defend themselves. These laws were the result of racial animosity and hysteria and not anything to do with the safety and security of this nation. We can continue to often do this over and over again by refusing to deal with the issues that are there, the denials, the refusals, the reflection, and insist on our infallibility, that we were not there, we're not responsible, it was our great-great-grandfathers or whomever who did this. And yet, with that kind of denial and deep examination of this nation's bigotry, we fail to understand the extreme importance of what we do. Too often, we don't want to be accountable. Acknowledging and apologizing for the pain that we have caused others is extremely important as a nation, because without doing that, it says to the future children that what took place was because there was a need for it, that it was for safety reasons or whatever it may be. And yet we have not fully apologized because there was no rationale for what was done other than the simple bigotry and racism that existed in this country. No one recognizes that more than African Americans, who have probably been the most degraded individuals in this nation in terms of the loss of their freedom and their life as they've tried to restructure their lives over and over again and find still the laws that come in that restrict their being and their movement and the actions that are there. And so it is, we understand it probably more than anyone else that the apologies are critical, that they're important, that they somehow or another make us equal or whole, because people have to acknowledge that they've done something wrong to you in order for them to heal as well and to not repeat those offenses again. You know, without an apology, as I said, we send a message to our children that what we did was justified. And therefore, when they are faced with the similar situations, they will do the same thing again. It is the big person who says we were wrong, we should never have done it, and we hope we'll never have to do it again. When I go to South Africa, it's always interesting when I visit the Apartheid Museum, that after you see all the atrocities that occurred there, and it's an amazing museum to go to, at the very end of the trip, when you're going through the museum and you get to the end, there's a room with a whole bunch of rocks. And everyone has to pick up a rock and say something very simple. And that simple statement is, never again. Real simple, never again. A recognition that this should never happen again to anyone for any reason in the world. And it's amazing how after going through the museum, my students are often in tears, but they're so proud when they pick up that rock and they toss it and say, never again. We have to get to the point where we recognize the errors of our past and we say to everyone, never again, and we mean it. I respectfully ask for your support for H.R. 77.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. Ms. Waldron, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise as a joint author of this important resolution, recognizing this stain on our nation's history. Therefore, it is critical that we recognize our nation's mistakes, right the wrongs of the past, and commit to building a better, more just future. With the stroke of a pen, patriotic Americans were torn from their homes, families, jobs, and businesses, and their very way of life. 1,862 people died in the camps. The horrifying chain of events represents one of history's great failures of leadership. Failure by President Franklin Roosevelt, who issued the executive order, failure by Congress to intervene, failure by state governments to protect their residents' civil rights and safety, and failure by the U.S. Supreme Court in its Korematsu ruling. Years later, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which apologized for the internment on behalf of the U.S. government. In his remarks, President Reagan recognized the patriotism and loyalty of the Japanese American people even after their country turned its back on them. So, members, today we also stand to apologize to the Japanese American people and vow never to repeat the mistakes of the past. I urge an aye vote.
Thank you, Ms. Waldron. Mr. Lowe, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker and members. I rise to, first of all, thank the member for Torrance for bringing this resolution forward. It's clearly recognized that representation matters. As a representative from San Jose and born in San Jose, I come from the camp and the legacy of former Congressman, former Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, former Congressman Mike Honda, who is also a member of this body. Mr. Honda was a mentor of mine, and he was also in the internment himself. And growing up in San Jose, I did not learn about this American history. And that's why representation matters, and this resolution is important. And it's great to see bipartisan support of this resolution, which gives us some pause to recognize the importance of education, the importance of ethnic studies. I learned about this, not in high school. I learned about it when I took Asian American Studies at De Anza Community College, to which then forced me then to say, what is my obligation as an American, and how come I didn't learn about American history as a fourth-generation Californian? And so this resolution is a reminder that we must continue to help educate our community, educate the future of California, but that we must reaffirm our commitment to these values and to the Japanese American community, an affirmation that we must continue the legacy of those who have come before us, and that your work, we stand on your shoulders. And so again, to the member from Torrance, thank you very much for this opportunity for us to recognize the importance of our collective American history.
Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Thank you, members. Mr. Speaker, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. I rise today to ask for your support for H.R. 77, but I also want to ask you to do something else, something perhaps more difficult. Voting on this apology should be one of the easiest votes that we take all year. It's clearly the right thing to do. And yet there are some things about it that need to be made entirely clear. The critical point of this resolution is not that we apologize for national policies against American citizens during World War II. We're not apologizing for cultural racism and fear almost 80 years ago. And we are not merely apologizing for the role that the state of California played in this injustice. As my colleague from Glendale pointed out, we are specifically apologizing for the wrongs that were committed on this floor, this floor where I now stand, and where all of us, all of our desks are now sit. H.R. 77 is our resolution, and we are apologizing for what we did. We, the legislature of California. This apology is overdue, but it is not the more difficult thing I ask of you and of myself. Important as this resolution is it is still just a resolution. It will mean nothing unless we learn from our past mistakes. It will mean nothing unless we ask ourselves the hard question that we wish our predecessors had asked themselves. In order that our successors are not left apologizing for what we do, we need to make sure that our actions on this floor every day are true and just. We need to make sure that the actions we take on this floor are not acts of racism against our own citizens, or racism against others for that matter. We need to stand strong for constitutional principles like innocent until proven guilty. We cannot stand for imprisoning men, women, and children for things they have not done. This is not just about incarceration a long time ago. This is about our system of justice in the present. The majority of those who suffered because of the Assembly's actions in the 1940s are now gone. They cannot hear the apology that we owe them. This stems from the past, but it must guide our actions in the present and far into the future. If we act justly in the present, it will mean a better future for California. I ask for your aye vote on H.R. 77.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Muratsuchi, you may close.
Thank you very much. I want to thank each and every member of this body who rose to speak in support of this resolution. I've never been more proud of being part of the California State Assembly than today. I really appreciate the level of awareness of the history regarding this tragic chapter in our nation's history. And I hope that the rest of the country can truly follow our leadership. I want to give special thanks to the Speaker and to the Minority Leader for their bipartisan leadership on this resolution. California leads by example. And I also want to thank Alf Brand with the Speaker's Office for his personal commitment to right or wrong through his work on this resolution. Members, I respectfully ask for your aye vote and ask for the first roll to be open for co-authors.
Thank you, Mr. Muratsuchi. Mr. Muratsuchi is requesting that the first roll be open for co-authors on the resolution. Clerk will open the roll. Members, this is for co-authors on H.R. 77. This is for co-authors on the resolution. This is for co-authors. The clerk will close the roll. There are 72 co-authors added. Without objection, we may take a voice vote on this resolution. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say nay. The ayes have it. The resolution is adopted. Mr. Muratsuchi, you are again recognized for your guest introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have a group of survivors, of camp survivors, as well as their family who have joined us today for this historic resolution. With us today are Christine Umeda, who was in the Tule Lake and Hard Mountain camp, Marion Uchida, Tule Lake, Jeanette Inoue, Tule Lake, Marielle Tsukamoto, Jerome, Kiyo Sato, Poston, Les Uchida, Jerome, Alan Korematsu, who's the grandnephew of Fred Korematsu. And representing the gentleman formerly incarcerated at Hart Mountain, the former mayor of San Jose, the former congressman and former United States Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta, are his sons, Dave and Stuart Mineta. Please join me in welcoming them to the Assembly Chambers.